Hello, very beautiful community. It's lovely to be with you. I'm sorry to be coming through so late. This is really as early as I felt I could get myself into a progressively vertical position, which I could speak to. Stay with me if I ramble, because I think if you have remotely an interest in American politics, as anybody must have who is interested in any global issue of importance, I think our chat will be important, and there'll be general takeaways beyond politics and for all politics, whatever country you're in. So I want to react a little bit to Kamala Harris's speech. I want to refer back to tips I gave on the main channel a few weeks ago toward what it would mean for Kamala to put herself in a stronger position to beat Trump. Review how many of them seem to have actually been adopted, what else needs to be done, and we'll say something about the difficulty and the state of the race as it is. So that's going to be roughly the agenda, and we'll mention also Tim Walz a little bit. Now, Kamala Harris in her speech, so let's start with her speech, then move on, needed to do several things, but at least two. She needed to not look fake, not communicate in a fake way. She needed ownership, something that hasn't been entirely present in her previous public communication. That's often the problem, right? You do something in private in an authentic way, you do it in public, and it's virtually identical, but there's just a little bit missing from it, and suddenly in the public space, with that little 10% chipped off your laugh or your mannerism, it looks inauthentic. It's very difficult. And I want to do a bit of a life meditation for you about what to do about things like that in politics and even outside, very, very briefly. So she needed to not look fake, and she needed to put country before party. And I feel she did both outstandingly well relative to expectation. My initial reaction and then some concrete thoughts, and then we'll do a little thought on Gaza too. Watching someone gain in confidence is one of the loveliest things in the world, and Kamala Harris is growing into her role, into her new role. That was my initial reaction. I said I am 8 out of 10 on Kamala's speech. By that I don't mean it's one of the greatest speeches ever made. I mean it's 8 out of 10 as far as producing a speech for Kamala for this occasion goes. And I'm 9 out of 10 on her performance, how she delivered what she needed to deliver. The speech was family, unity, America, security, opportunity, and Trump unserious. The performance was more mature, more embodied, more formidable than in her past, virtually no play acting. And let's do a very quick meditation before diving back into explicitly political matters. When something is not going right for you, let us say communicatively, you've got two options. You can come back out of it, or you can go further into it. Let me do something strange that might weird you out, so we will be brief with it, but it's important. If you don't have any interest in classical music, it's irrelevant to my example, because you'll get the point anyway. There was a great composer called Friedrich Chopin, whose greatest masterpiece is the 24 Preludes, Opus 28. And Chopin did something extraordinary with kitsch, with sentimentality. When Beethoven or Schumann approach sentimentality, they say, uh-oh, no way am I coming anywhere near that, unless it's like a special situation. I'm getting some cash for something trashy, I can do that, fine. Beethoven was open to that. Rarely, but open. But I've encountered some sentimentality and kitsch, I back out of it. Chopin was unique in the tradition of that kind of musical language to say, you know what, I've encountered kitsch, sentimentality, I'm not going to back out of it, I'm going to go through it. until it stops being kitsch and gains a kind of morbid intensity, right? So let's give this a sort of a non-musical equivalence. So Chopin is sitting at the piano, his partner and her kids might be out for a walk, and he might have a thought, oh my, what if something happened to them? It's stormy outside. You know, we're in Mallorca, I'm writing my 24 preludes, you know, Georges Sand is out with the kids. What if they've fallen off a cliff? Sentimental. But then you go further, right? And you sort of viscerally imagine decomposition. You viscerally imagine bones, spirits, right? You are now in a space that is not sentimental at all. It's different. You've now reached a kind of morbid intensity in his particular case. So, but what we can learn from that, forgetting the example I've given, is that you can go forward into something. And so when we talk about Kamala laughing at home authentically, but that looking a bit fake in public when something is chipped off it, a really good point might be, look, Kamala, maybe don't laugh as much in certain particular occasions, but in other occasions, laugh more, own it, go further, right? There's a slight problem, go further rather than take steps back, and the problem will you know, fall away. That shell that you're in will drop off if you go further into it rather than climbing out of it. So that's very, very important. Very often going further into something is the right way to do, and most humans, when things don't work, play defense. And I think some of what Kamala has done, with help clearly, recently, is she has gone forward in some of her mannerisms rather than backing out of them. That would have been fake, actually. So Biden should have been in attendance when she spoke. The first 8 minutes were personal, and you might say, where's America in this? But she linked my story with America's story, and she needed to do this because it is shocking how much America still needs an introduction to Kamala Harris. And that was justified. It had downsides. You're talking about yourself for 8 minutes, but it was necessary. And I'd even go as far as it needed that 8 minutes. One of the most important things she did, and this is what any good political strategist would have told one to do in her situation, is just stop, look directly into the camera and say something about putting the country before party. So quit your speech, quit your teleprompter, directly into the camera, boom. She did that. That was really important. She talked about doing something, not complaining, a la Michelle Obama. She positioned herself as a protector. She was dressed. It's very important that she wasn't dressed in something colorful and wasn't dressed in something sort of white or beige, which would have been a disaster. She had to be dressed in black. She talked about security on our border, safety of our communities. Talked about Trump's weaknesses in a pinpoint and emphatic way, which hasn't been done enough. And that's partly how Hillary lost in 2016, by not taking Trump seriously enough. And she said Trump is easy to manipulate by flattery and favor from autocrats. She didn't talk about being a woman, didn't talk about being black or Indian, and that was correct on this occasion. Gaza. She did on the one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand, on the other hand. And a very interesting question arises. I mean, a lot of you wrote to me and said, I didn't like that part of the speech. She deeply empathized with Israel and outrightly and explicitly condemned the extraordinary barbarism that happened in early October 2023. She called the situation in Gaza devastating, implied it wasn't okay, and talked about the dignity and self-determination of the Palestinian people. So she described the situation in Gaza as a natural disaster, not something caused by a state propped up by another state. And I've got 8 or 9 videos on this at the end of 2023, where I articulate the complexities of this, because this needs a lot of time. But certainly it's my position that Israel is engaged in destruction without strategy, without constructive strategy. Now, if I were, which I would never be in my life, a political strategist or a political advisor for Kamala Harris, and she said to me, Vlad, can I add an extra word here about having condemned the extraordinary barbarism of early October? Can I add a word here to go beyond devastating and the kind of natural disaster framing? A word that will help me rather than hinder me from winning. And my honest answer would have been, let's look at the words. Disproportionate, unacceptable, unjustifiable, would have got a roar in the space. Would it help her beat Trump saying that? I honestly couldn't recommend to add that word in if the condition for adding it in is that it should increase her chances of beating Trump. Right? So if she were more comfortably in the lead, this would be more possible. But we're also, of course, going to have to see not so much where her heart is at there, because you can see where her heart is leading, but whether she will let it speak, because the bottom line reality is that in some countries, USA, UK, Germany, there's a kind of a multi-party, bipartisan position on Israel that basically co-opts anybody in power into a degree of unconditionality of support for the Israeli government's policies. It's very difficult to challenge indeed. So my response to those of you who don't like this bit of the speech and are hearing me praise the speech is, well, keep 2 things in mind at the same time. Before we get to what more needs to be done and what's next and the state of the race, let's talk about what I think is the most important in impressiveness, at least, most significant in impressiveness, political speech in English this decade. And that speech is by Michelle Obama. And the speech is remarkable for what she did with it rather than the words she used. And it's a speech of extraordinary power for many of you who are closest to me, who are closest to our conversation. It was almost chillingly engaging with some of the themes that really matter, in my opinion, simply because they're so rarely engaged in by mainstream politics. So it's a speech to the country, or to half of the country at least, in an age of democratic decline, that responds to democratic decline with, let's fight, let's do better, with politicization, not depoliticization. And so at the heart of Michelle's speech, which was the most unbuttoned speech she'd ever given, the most demanding and generous speech she'd ever given, was the question, can decent people still have a politics adequate to who they are? Can we still have a politics that does decent by us? Or is that historical moment gone? It looks like we're in a time when that historical moment is going. So we may be entering an age of the unavailability of a politics that is good enough for the populations of the different Western countries. Maybe entering an age where it's impossible to snap out of a dynamic in which politics fails us. And I mean fails us more systemically than it's failed before. That's to say, by itself beginning to crack, by its own procedures and institutions beginning to crack. So, can decent people still have a politics that's adequate to who they are, is the core question at the heart of Michelle's speech. And her answer is, I don't know, but now I feel a bit more hope than I felt before. It's a speech by somebody who believes that Kamala is unlikely to win, but who thinks it's essential that Kamala wins and that she can win and that it can be made to happen. Right? We can get there, but we're up against it. And let's cut the nonsense and face that reality. No complacency in the face of a very, very big uphill battle that is not just a battle produced by certain circumstances, it's a battle produced by wider political forces, right? That aren't just particular to the United States and aren't just particular to this election cycle. So it really is a speech that, without naming any of this stuff we might blabber on about my 4+4, the causes of the democratic decline, the feelings citizens who've lost trust feel, it still absolutely centered that without articulating it, by really conveying it, such that most people wouldn't have got it, but a lot of people would have got 10 or 20% of that from it subconsciously. That was the power of it. And she was really holding the nation, or holding half of the nation with this, right? It was almost a parental speech, almost a motherly speech for a nation, or half of the nation, that was perhaps deluded about its own predicament, but needed to get its act together. So that mattered more than the particular lines that stood out. It was a speech of parental ownership that said, you have got to face the reality of the age you're in, right? Somebody wrote to me, almost movingly really, Vlad, I kind of feel almost sick when you talk about Western democracy in decline, because I think it's out there, these Russians, these Chinese are trying to get us. But our democracies would just be okay without that. And the fact that you're talking about them declining for internal reasons just makes me feel sick, and I don't want to believe that. And you know how jumpy I am all over the place, and that's really the job of a public intellectual, and also like a baby public intellectual like me, who's always improving and needs to improve a lot, right? I'm sometimes soft, I'm sometimes harsh, I'm sometimes like pum pum pum, let's shake ourselves up, and sometimes I'm gentle. Michelle said, shut up, shut up. You feel sick? Shut up. Listen. That's where you are. Act. And that's a very difficult thing to pull off. We've also got to appreciate that it is harder to pull off for a woman, and it's harder to pull off for a black woman, And she thought a lot about how to do this properly. Notice how her hair was done, for instance, right? Pushed back like this. She did it. What allowed, in part, Michelle to do this is another little meditation. It's important for politics, though. It's beyond politics, it's important for politics. What allowed Michelle to do this is that she does not trigger men the way AOC does, the way Hillary Clinton does, and the way Kamala Harris does, or did. Still does, but a little bit did as a result of the sort of ownership in her speech, which was so impressive and not very triggering. So I found the beautiful Rory Stewart talking about how remarkable AOC's speech was and how animated AOC was and what an extraordinary communicator AOC was. And Rory Stewart is a very beautiful British conservative political animal and many other things too. Somebody who's very beautiful in their political sentiments, even if you don't share them. But I like AOC. I am not triggered by anything AOC does, sort of communication-wise, but AOC's speech was triggering to a large percentage of the country, the way Michelle Obama's was, and same with Hillary Clinton. Hillary did better this time, I'll say a word about that, but in 2016, Hillary was enormously triggering. And now, sometimes you've got to be tough and say, you can do a better job communicating, so you don't have this triggering effect. And that doesn't mean, you see, it doesn't mean being weak. It can actually mean if you're even stronger, some of the triggering effect will go away. But the reality is that men find it difficult to tolerate the feminine part of their nature, and that is the psychoanalytic root of prejudice against women, and it's always apt for being triggered in particular circumstances. And we've got to be honest about that. It's not enough to say, well, I'm not triggered, I love these communication styles. That's not good enough, right? You've got to be realistic about how things go down. But Michelle has always been remarkable at being very low on triggering men. And that allowed her to deliver what I thought was an extraordinary speech that absolutely made the excellent speech Barack gave after pale in comparison. Now, a quick refresh on some of the tips I gave a few weeks ago. And I think I gave 6. One is not so relevant anymore, perhaps. 1, Kamala needs 48 hours of hardcore communication training. She's a much nicer person than she comes across. Number 1. I think we've seen some of that. 2, she needs to reintroduce herself to the American people. And I'll link up that video from a few weeks ago in case you haven't seen it on the main channel. It really flopped, but I just wanted to communicate this because I felt it was important. So I'll link that up at the end of this. And she did spend 8 minutes in a superb way of introducing herself. 3, and this is for the post-convention period, really. She needs to prove her range, have a vision and answers to tough questions on, she began to do it actually in the speech, on foreign policy, immigration, crime. 4, she needed to answer tough questions about Joe Biden's Democratic decline. The first question doesn't matter anymore much, really. Why hasn't he stepped down if his decline is significant enough to not run a second time? And the next question is, this is still part of the 4th question, 4B, is when did you first know about Biden's cognitive decline and what did you do about it? let me make an important remark here. In Biden's hour-long speech, which you have to give him, he wanted to do that as part of his legacy. If I were advising him, which would be the last job I would ever take, I would say, you're gaslighting the country unless you explain why you've stood down. Leaving it vague about why you've stood down is unacceptable. It gaslights the country and absolutely hurts voters who are on the bubble, who can see things with their own eyes, and then you're telling them that you've stepped down because some polls didn't look right and you were worried you were going to have an undermining effect on your country's politics as the result. Yes, but why were the polls looking bad? What was the reason for that? What was wrong? So he needed to stand up and say, I don't know what, I haven't thought in my head what the language would be, but it'd be something like a reference to his age, to the fact that some of his capacities are still phenomenal, but other capacities aren't there anymore, and he needed to put the country first in recognizing that. That would be very powerful and healing for the country to hear that. That didn't come. My fifth tip was to pick an offensive rather than a defensive VP. That's to say that it doesn't matter who you pick, the psychology behind why you're choosing that person is that it's an attack mode choice rather than a defensive choice. Well, what are we going to do to protect ourselves against the bad attacks coming our way, and how do we minimize bad things that could happen? No, you need to get out there and push. And I think that emphatically happened. We'll say more about that in a second. 6, she's got to hit Trump relentlessly and also expose Vance's ludicrous entrepreneurialism and divide Vance and Trump. Now, before we jump more beyond this, let's say something and talk about Kamala's future steps. Let's talk a little bit about Tim Walz and do another meditation, maybe our third meditation of the day, this time on populism. So there were plenty of strategic reasons to go for Mark Kelly, to go for Josh Shapiro. And there are plenty of rumors in Washington, right, that the talks didn't go as well as they could have done with Josh Shapiro. So, in many ways, the VP pick could be a byproduct of lots of things that happen behind the scenes that we just don't know. Some disagreements, some mismatch of expectations, some mismatch of a sense of what one's priority as a VP should be vis-a-vis the president. Maybe, Josh Shapiro felt like he needed some more, and Kamala felt that would undermine her to give him that. It could be some people had some dodgy bits to their history that would complicate them PR-wise. We just don't know. But the outcome is outstanding. So I'm somebody who actually takes the minority view, to which I think more people are coming over now, which is that Tim Walz was the best pick. And I began to feel that at a certain point, and part of the reason was this. He has an element of constructive populism. Now notice what I take populism to be. Populism for me isn't the problem with our democracies. It's a particular phenomenon that mostly expresses itself destructively in our political cultures, but can express itself constructively. There can be such a thing as a pro-institutional, inclusive, non-exclusionary populism. It's difficult to do, but you can have it. You could certainly have a dollop of it, like Tim Walz has. So populism is really when, at the level of discourse, politics bridges with the private sphere by moving toward the private sphere, right? So I grew up in the USSR, first 9.5 years of my life before I moved to Israel in 1990. And there, the regime wanted private discourse, your kitchen table talk, to move toward public discourse. They wanted you to recite banalities at the kitchen table, right? The formulaic banalities of communist propaganda. So that was an attempt to draw private sentiment toward public discourse. What populism does is move public discourse, the general ways in which democracies justify themselves to themselves, towards sounding like the kitchen table conversation. The risk of that is you're going to sound like you don't take procedure seriously. You're going to sound like you don't take ritual process of democracy seriously. But certainly, we need to talk more about this, but a dollop of this, bridging public discourse with private sentiment by moving public discourse toward private sentiment, is very constructive if you do it non-exploitatively. And Tim Walz does that. And he does that actually while also not just being, middle-class dad and coach. He's also extremely sharp on policy detail and very worldly, very outward-looking and conscious of what is going on in the world. So a very, very impressive package, even though he isn't the choice that's out there to, get you a particular state that you might not get without him over the line. Now, a word on, that's the end of this other meditation on populism. And final remark on that meditation. The point is that public discourse shouldn't drift too close toward private sentiment, otherwise it'll get threatening to democratic institutions. But also, private discourse shouldn't drift, as it did in the communist countries, too close to public discourse. So it's about the degree of distance and the place at which they're floating in relation to one another, rather than some fixed point where they need to be. They shouldn't be too close, shouldn't be too far. And what populism does is move the public toward the private with the risk of them becoming too close. Quick remark on Hillary Clinton before Kamala's future steps. Now, one of the things that's important to understand about Hillary Clinton is how much trauma she has. And her trauma manifests in her going progressively inauthentic and robotic, the more at stake there is, and the more it's about her. So the ultimate situation where everything is at stake and it's all about her is the situation in which she freezes the most. Because she is a hyper-competent, you might despise her, right? But she's a hyper-competent political operative. Traumatic freezing for Hillary is still, boom, going forward with full force and efficacy, but in a more fake and robotic way, right? And speaking at this convention, she was freer. Kamala's future. When I give psychological clues about who's winning, who's losing, they're clues. If you wanted to say, Vlad, put your stupid clues down and give me actual probabilities, like the real probabilities. The problem is, with uncertain outcomes, it always drifts toward 50-50. The more uncertain an outcome, the more it should drift toward 50-50. So what you want is to understand these as psychological clues about how we look at the race at this point. And I feel in the last few months, we moved from virtually a 90-95% chance of Trump winning against Biden a few months ago, to Biden stepping down, and that creating a kind of a 70-30 race. And over the last few weeks, since the main channel video, which I'm going to link up at the end, Kamala has been surging and Trump has been flailing. He won't necessarily keep on flailing, that's the problem, but he has been flailing and imploding. And in my view, as things stand now, Kamala's trajectory is up, but it's going to get so much harder than it has been so far for her. And Trump's trajectory is down. Given that, I'd put it 60-40 in Trump's favor at the moment. So it's Trump's race to lose. If Trump makes no mistake, I don't think there's anything Kamala Harris can do to win. Trump is making mistake after mistake after mistake. They aren't epic mistakes, but they're small but significant mistakes. At the same time, if Trump continues to make many mistakes, Kamala Harris will probably win. If he makes fewer mistakes, but Kamala Harris's campaign is phenomenally done, she can still win. If Trump makes no mistakes, it's going to be extraordinarily hard for her to win. So it's 60-40, but Trump's trending down and she's trending up. The problem is, the more Kamala articulates herself and her project and her vision, the more there'll be something for Trump to attack, and the more he will develop strategies he hasn't developed yet and quit the punch yourself in the face strategies he's had so far. The next really, really big challenge is the interactive environment for Kamala Harris. Not just debating Trump, but interacting with journalists, back and forth, back and forth. What she has shown phenomenally is that she can do it in a forward-facing speech, facing a big audience. She has brought authenticity to that wasn't there even weeks ago. Remarkable. Phenomenal. It's bloody hard, twice as hard, to bring the same authenticity to policy back and forth talk with journalists and to a Trump debate where Trump will try to turn it into a circus and constantly derail it. This is going to be really difficult, and it requires another big leap forward for Kamala Harris, whose public conversation has often been more impressive when she talks in general terms and less impressive when she talks about policy. My impression is she's potentially stronger on policy behind the scenes than some of her public commentaries suggest. She often produces word salad when she talks policy, if you look over the last few years. She may well be capable of transcending that over the next few weeks, and she needs to. So then the transference of the sort of one on many into the back and forth, right, into the interactive environment is the next step. Now, next point, it's going to be a brutal character assault on Kamala Harris over the next few weeks. Maybe unprecedented in some ways. And Trump's going to try relentlessly and drop things that don't work, keep things that work. It's going to be brutal, really, really tough. So she is, to misuse our metaphor about democracy, still coming out of the bay into open water. She needs to aggressively attack back Trump's attacks on her. Unless they are counterproductive, then she can ignore them or be silent. And she needs hardcore attacks on Trump's policies, even if Trump doesn't talk about them. And her campaign, and I think they will do that, need to take Trump very, very seriously. Not just as a formidable opponent, but as an opponent who is flailing a bit in the race, but is ahead. With some of the bookmakers, Trump was, having been behind, again a little ahead before the convention, and now he is again infinitesimally behind. It's sort of 51-49. But I think the correct way to see this is, yes, Trump is flailing because some of his techniques aren't working, but he'll try to change his running technique, and as a result we should be very worried about the fact that he's still ahead. But he can be caught, and he is going to make mistakes in all likelihood. So, it's doable. That's the story. One last factor would just be a nice balance, which I think they stand a very good chance of doing well, between the Obamas, both of the Obamas, being extremely involved without overshadowing Tim and Kamala. Enough. Thank you so much for surviving this. I will crash back into a horizontal position now, and I'm very grateful that it's been possible to talk with you like this today. Lots of love till the next time.